All right, y'all, welcome. Thank you all so much for coming. We are really excited that you've joined us for the Justice Education Series hosted by the Petey Greene Program. We have some longtime friends of the PGP along with some new faces, so I think that everyone's going to be in for a really great presentation this evening. Just as a reminder about the format, we can't see or hear y'all, but you should be able to use the Q&A feature. So be sure that you put anything in the Q&A if you have questions that come up. So as many of you already know, the Petey Greene Program is the largest multi-state provider of tutoring and college readiness programs in carceral spaces. We support the educational journeys of currently and formerly incarcerated learners in a range of programs, kind of from the DC area all the way up to the Boston area. The work we do to support the freedom dreams of the students we serve with one-on-one tutoring is measurable, it's meaningful, and it is the foundation of what we do here at the PGP. But there's also another component of the work that we do, and that's providing volunteers and the greater community with the resources that they need to understand the larger systems that lead to mass incarceration in the United States, and to understand the multifaceted and kind of multidimensional impacts that the criminal legal system has on individuals and on communities. One way that we accomplish this is through invited talks like tonight's Justice Education Series webinar, Experiences of Disability in Prisons and Jails. So people with disabilities are overrepresented in carceral spaces. There's kind of a long history of disability being tied to deviance, to danger, to criminality. Disability studies scholar Susan Schweik traces how these kind of laws targeting unsightly beggars kind of intertwine racist, ableist, and classist ideologies in kind of the late 19th century. But this continues on today. People with disabilities are overrepresented in the legal system. They're more likely to be arrested, more likely to be convicted, and face harsher sentences. Because people with disabilities are over-policed and over-incarcerated, because prison itself can be disabling, and because issues of disability and access are key to any justice-driven approach to learning and tutoring, tonight's talk provides important context to the work we do here at the PGP. So tonight we're honored to have Rachel Sievers, who serves as a program attorney with AVID, with Disability Rights Washington, and Evie Webb, an assistant corrections ombuds with the Office of the Corrections Ombuds. They're going to talk for about an hour, and then we'll have time for questions. So please jot anything down so that we can extend the conversation afterwards. So thank you both for being here, and I will pass it over to you, Rachel.
Hi, thanks. So I'm Rachel Sievers. I'm an attorney with Disability Rights Washington. I focus most of my work working with folks in the state prisons, a little bit in some of our special commitment center facilities, and really I've been doing that for about 10 years. I think it's, you know, people with disabilities, as the intro, as sort of folks heard, about 40% of people currently in our state prisons identify as having a disability. I would guess that is a massive undercount because that is what's being reported to the feds in the state prisons. So, you know, we started at my work at Disability Rights Washington, started working with folks in the prisons because we really saw that's where our constituents were calling from. And really had the least access to any kind of information or connections to disability related services that from the folks we're hearing from. So that's sort of where I'm coming at in this work. No, Evie.
Hi, my name is Evie Webb. My pronouns are they, them, or he, him. I am an assistant corrections ombuds with the OCO. The OCO is the Office of the Corrections Ombuds. It is in Washington State, and we do essentially oversight of the state prison facilities and reentry centers. I've been with the office. I'll be celebrating my 5 years in November. And during my time at the office, I've mostly done investigations into healthcare concerns, working individual cases, but also trying to address some of the systemic issues as well. Happy to share more if y'all have questions. And I know that there was a video mentioned. Are we going to watch the video first, or do you want us to continue with our intros and questions?
Yeah, Rachel, what do you think?
I mean, we can talk a little bit about just sort of the general, what is the history of the ADA, why are we here, kind of concept. I mean, just briefly, and I don't want to nerd out and bore everyone to death about the history of the ADA, but I think the basic idea of what it is and how it applies in the carceral context is helpful in thinking about how we work with folks in the prisons and why it is particularly hard for folks with disabilities to get the accommodations and services that they're going to need in a place like a prison. I mean, just in general, the ADA was passed in 1990. It was found by the Supreme Court to apply to prisons about 8 years later. There are various titles in the ADA that apply to different settings. Title II is generally the one that is going to apply to public services like state prisons and jails that we're talking about here. Essentially, the ADA states that no qualified individual with a disability shall, by reason of disability, be excluded from participation or be denied in the benefits and services or programs of a public entity or be subject to discrimination. So essentially, people with disabilities should have access to the same kinds of programs and services that are being provided to other folks. If it goes further and says that the facilities and entities must make reasonable modifications and accommodations to people, either in policy or practice, if those are required to get people the access that they need. The only exception to that really is if doing that modification or accommodation would be a fundamental alteration to the program services. So just because, for instance, a policy says you cannot have a cane in solitary confinement, if someone needs a cane in solitary confinement as an accommodation, the policy needs to be modified for that person. So that's sort of the context in which we're talking about people with disabilities coming into a prison that is really focused on, in my opinion, sort of being as non-individualized as humanly possible. Everyone gets the same thing, everyone goes the same place, everybody eats the same food, everybody has the same clothes. And the definition of reasonable accommodations is really individualized, right? And the assessment of what someone with a disability needs to participate in services and programs is intentionally under the ADA an individualized process where the person is part of this sort of interactive conversation about what it is that they need as far as accommodations go, which is really, I think, in many ways sort of antithetical to what prisons are designed to do and trying to do with people, which I think is really impacts how people are experiencing those places and how prisons are responding to people who are asking for accommodations, because it's not special treatment. It is by definition the requirement of the ADA that you get accommodations that you need. So that's sort of like the general basis for applying the ADA in the prison context. And that applies to all disabilities, right? So one of the questions we get a lot when we go into the prisons to talk to folks is, what disabilities do you cover, right? And it's I think, because again, it's a state prison context, it is very medicalized, and sort of the medical services department and the mental health services all sort of force people into boxes of what is qualifying them for something or not, which again is not the point of getting accommodations and working with folks for individualized needs, but is what the prisons often force people into. So for our purposes at Disability Rights Washington, when we go into prisons, we are working with people with sensory disabilities, with intellectual disabilities. We're working with folks with serious mental illness. We're working with folks with learning disabilities, like just all the range of things that people are looking for accommodations for. is really what we're looking at. Again, the prisons often are forcing people into sort of a very narrow box, but that is not, in fact, what the ADA usually defines disability as.
I really appreciate that you put that in the context of like the culture of prisons and how it clashes. I think that's what came up for me when I was looking at this question too, around how, yeah, ADA and the culture of prison safety, security, that kind of idea that everyone has the same exact thing, it just doesn't match well. And so you see a lot of issues come up from that because the prisons weren't built and a lot of the ways that it run were not with ADA in mind or the people who need disability accommodations in mind.
I think it's relevant when you think about also sort of where disability related issues show up a lot. I mean, everything in prison is a struggle, right? Getting access to anything is a struggle. And physical accommodations. So if you think about the sort of concrete edges and bars and slab concrete beds and just all of the various sort of hard surfaces in a prison, right? Physical accommodations, getting anything in that environment changed is incredibly difficult. Having for instance, if someone has trouble climbing a ladder to a top bunk, getting permission, you have to get permission from the facility to have a lower bunk often, and getting that permission is hard, can be hard, and you can be denied. You can get it for 6 months and then lose it. You can get moved to a new cell and lose it, or a new facility here in Washington at least, and lose it. And so I think, for you all, knowing the sort of background trauma that is happening to people and the sort of background struggle that is happening on almost every facet of your life in prison to try and get what you need, I think is something to sort of always be aware of. A lower bunk can be a huge deal to someone, right? And losing that massively disrupting. Same thing with like having a pass to not use the stairs and to be able to use an elevator if there's an elevator, being in a facility that doesn't have an elevator and so you have to use the stairs to get to required services. I think people often think disability and think, physical accommodations. I think that's one that a lot of people sort of run into in their daily life. And I think that's a big one, obviously in the prison context. There's also programmatic accessibility though, right? And so when we sort of think about access, it's both physical accessibility and programmatic accessibility. So when people are trying to participate in educational programming, even to ask to do things in prison, many times you have to do something in writing, right? You have to send what in Washington here we call it a kite request. So you have to send a written request to go to programming, to be enlisted in a class, to be enrolled in something, to see the doctor, to see medical, to get a dental appointment. Like literally everything is in writing. If that is not accessible to you, getting those services can be incredibly difficult. In some cases, having alternative ways of communicating, like being able to send in something on a tape cassette, right, could be a thing. I know in Washington we had that set up, and then they had trouble even finding tape cassettes and like recorders because we just like no one uses those really anymore, right? And so just like the technology itself became difficult because it wasn't a common technology. Having alternative formats in classes can be game changing for people. Having here in Washington, they created a different curriculum for folks with serious mental illness who were going through some required programming to make sure that it was understandable and like the appropriate speed and time for folks in those units. That wasn't in place until just a couple of years ago. And so before that, everybody had been going to the same class and oftentimes people failing out because it wasn't appropriate for them. So the programmatic accessibility, I think, is another one that comes up for us a lot. And then the other parts that are sort of in a lot of prisons, in Washington at least, there is specialized housing, which is going to present its own challenge Because even if you could access educational programming, for instance, in general population, a lot of folks with disabilities are housed in specialized units. Here in Washington, we have an assisted living unit for folks who are sort of have extensive medical needs. Those people are also wanting to participate in a lot of the programs and services, but are unable to leave that unit as much as people on general population are. We have a residential mental health unit, again, very little access to educational programming for folks on that unit currently. So just this sort of being, and then solitary is its own beast, and restricted housing in any kind of facility is going to make it even harder for people to access anything, both because they have very little access to the outside world and often very little possessions and ability to send requests and get to programming. So I would say like those are all things that to me, when I think about what are folks that we're working with in the prisons encountering, the sort of specialized housing removal from everyone else's programming, the programmatic accessibility and the physical accessibility is sort of a lot of times the biggest sort of realm of things that we're talking to folks about. I don't know, Evie, if you have other experiences.
Yeah, I think you hit on several things that were also on my list, so I won't repeat those, but I think there's a couple examples that I could kind of add to. Um, One of the things that came up for me around like kind of common issues is around the ADA coordinators at the facilities. And so in Washington State, there are specific staff at facilities that are designated as ADA coordinators. That might be different in different states as far as whether or not those positions even exist. But we do get a lot of concerns from people about the folks who are in ADA coordinator roles have very minimal ADA training, and that's not their sole responsibility. And so oftentimes the ADA coordinator role is tacked onto their general role, whatever their staff position is, with like I said, limited training, support resources, and I think that's an issue we've seen over time. I think a lot of people are wanting to see ADA coordinators or ADA specialists that are heavily trained specialists in that area, that are focusing on that kind of support and it not just being like an additional thing that's tacked on to someone's workload. The work, education, and classroom accommodations, that's definitely a common thing. I would say like access to ADA accessible cells. There's a limitation on the number of ADA cells that are even available. And then there's questions about the whether they're actually ADA accessible. Um, And so that's already like a built-in limitation for the way that the prisons are built and what rooms are even available. We've seen cases where people have gone through a review process to get updated bars or things within their cells for accommodation and either been denied or, been told, oh, there's a work order, and then the work order never happens. And people kind of go in circles around that. And then the prisons are really hesitant to make a physical change to a cell for an individual because they're thinking about, well, that individual may not live here forever, so they're seeing it as just for one person instead of seeing it as a way to expand how many ADA cells are actually available in general at the facility. Um, I'm thinking about things like DME, like durable medical equipment, and I think Rachel spoke a little bit to, there are specific units that people have extra layers of restrictions. And so we've seen and worked and had to step in on cases where someone has durable medical equipment, such as a brace or crutches or a wheelchair or a cane or something like that. And the solitary confinement policy is, not allowing for those certain items. And so people are having to go through extra processes to get permission for those, or we've had to step in when someone's transferred to solitary and their DME has been taken. We've had to step in and say this person's needs have not changed, just their location. And so trying to have those conversations with prison staff around understanding safety, security is what they're always going to frame things as. Trying to understand that there's limitations, but still pushing that they need to accommodate what this person needs while they're living there. Um, that's really common. I think there's also some like general things across Washington that I'm imagining probably in other states too, just as far as limited providers and access to mental health services, things like physical therapy. There's like very limited physical therapy resources in the prisons and even in community. That's something we're looking at right now across the state, just as far as people not being able to access physical therapy. Um, I think another thing that comes to mind is telecommunications. So I think each state might have a different telecommunication provider. But what we're seeing right now is that the current telecommunication provider that is in place in the state is not providing equal access to phone calls. There are very limited ADA supports in general for people who are trying to use the securest tablets for phone calls, for communications, that kind of thing. So thinking about things like how can someone with disabilities equally access what is afforded to the whole population as far as the amount of time that they're supposed to be given for phone calls, communications, that kind of thing. I think about things like video visits, and there's just like layers of limitations because the tablets and the telecommunications system was not built with people with disabilities in mind. And so they're running into that a lot now, especially as these new tablets are kind of rolling out. A couple other things, I would say we've gotten lots of concerns around transport vehicles. And so there's been situations where, say, an incarcerated person is set to transfer to another prison. There are codes that are supposed to correspond to specialized transport. Sometimes we've had to step in and say, this person's code is not up to date. And so DOC would not even see that this person needed specialized transport because they hadn't been updated in the system as needing that. And so there's been situations where people come out for transport in a wheelchair. They're supposed to have a wheelchair accessible transport van. They don't. I know we've reviewed cases where people are then thrown into the van regardless and their wheelchairs are taken, or they are sent back and another transport order has to be put in place and they have to go through all the processes of getting the specialized transport. Um, there's also access assistance within Washington prisons, which I think the name is more than the services. Like I don't know if other states also have something similar, but the access assistants are typically other incarcerated people who are, it's essentially their job that they're assigned to is to say like an access assistant would do anything from pushing someone in a wheelchair to their appointment or to programming or helping them write a grievance or something like that. But I've seen lots of cases where people are reviewed and denied for an access assistant. And then there's also limitations on what the access assistant can and can't help with. Um, so even though that's a resource that's in place, I think there's still a lot of limitations to it. And it again, the name I think says a lot more than what people are actually able to assist with. Um, I think the last thing I'll speak on as far as the way our office is looking at ADA, We went through a strategic planning process just recently over the past, I want to say it's been like the past year or two. And one of the things that we did as a part of the strategic planning process is we got input on like, what are the top concerns that y'all want us to focus on? We're a very small staff. We get hundreds of new cases in. And so we were like, we need to focus in on what's important. And across the board, our stakeholders said healthcare, #1 priority. And so for our office, healthcare includes medical, dental, it also includes ADA. And the way that we're viewing those cases is those are at the top of our list. We're getting to those first. And because of DRW's work around the transgender settlement with DOC and making sure trans individuals are having access to medical care, since that was like a recent settlement, we are considered anything that is in that settlement an ADA issue. So it also goes to the top of our list for reviewing. So that would be things like transgender people who are dealing with housing issues or safety issues or PREA and that kind of thing. So that's one way that we're kind of trying to think about these issues in a broad sense and also make sure that they rise to the top of the huge amounts of cases that we're getting. And that's all in kind of like the state prison context. I think that there's maybe fewer restrictions and limitations in a reentry center, but the reentry centers in our state are also not full. There's very few people living there. So there's like, I'll just be upfront, like for me, there's an assumption of fewer restrictions, fewer limitations in a reentry center because just in general, that's how reentry centers are versus state prisons. However, if there's not appropriate staffing, if there's no one at that reentry center that can support or follow through on accommodation, maybe it isn't easier. So, but it does look a little bit different as far as the way the facilities are built, people's options for movement, that kind of thing at reentry. And I think one of the other questions was around like post-release, and I'll just name that a lot of our work is with currently incarcerated people in state prisons. And so I don't know that I can speak to post-release issues for folks.
Thanks, Evie. I appreciate all those like specific, like this is what this looks like. I think, we are obviously both from Washington. And so some of the examples and things that we're talking about are Washington specific, but I think thematically a lot of, I think a lot of times the same issues are coming up in systems across the country. I have a report that I don't know if I can I'm going to put it in the chat. We'll see if it works. Technologically, not great at this. I don't know. We issued a report a few years ago, actually probably almost 10 years ago at this point, related to sort of looking at the ADA across different systems in different states. So I know you all, or most of you on the East Coast, in different states. And so that report might be helpful in thinking through sort of both what entity in your state does work in the prisons related to disability, because there is a protection and advocacy organization like DRW in every state. And some of them do work in the prisons, some of them don't. But this report can give you sort of an idea of if you're in a state that has some of the things being reported out, they would be a good contact if you have sort of more questions about, well, what does this look like in my state? Are there ADA coordinators? Are there people that I can be reaching out to or be aware of, or how does this work here? So that might be a good resource for people. I know, Evie spoke really briefly to sort of reentry and such. Like the ombuds, we focus more on people who are currently incarcerated and the sort of conditions, that didn't work. The conditions of current incarceration, but to some of the things that we've dealt with are people who are approaching release and how you can do release planning and how you can access sort of services once you're released. Generally, accessible housing in the community is a massive barrier. And we have worked with folks who are ready for release. They've reached their release date and they can't find housing in the community that's appropriate. And DOC has very little incentive generally to try and find appropriate housing for folks. So those people will often just stay in prison longer because they can't find housing in the community, not because they're not ready for release. It's just that the housing is a problem. People being connected from the medical care in DOC, whatever level that is, into the community, having a sort of any kind of continuity of care, or having a medical appointment that is scheduled and approved and you're like know where it is set up before you're released. Releasing with medications is sometimes an issue. So if you're getting medications while you're in DOC, making sure you have a prescription and a provider and a place to go and insurance and all of the things can often be a huge challenge. And something that we had done, again, a while ago, and someone found the link, so thank you, was a video on the outs, which was really focused on following a couple individuals with disabilities who are releasing to sort of see, like, what does this look like? And I think for me, when we made that video, I just assumed that DOC knew we were tracking these people because we were going in with cameras and we were talking to them and we were requesting records. That their release planning would look great, and it wouldn't be a very good representation because obviously these people are going to get sort of like the specialized version of release planning, which is not what happened. It was as bad as you could assume it ever is, and that was people that we were actively paying attention to and like hassling about, which to me was even scarier, I think, because it was like, even under the best case scenario, this is what happens. So it's pretty short video, but it is like a good snapshot, I think, of the very many different ways that release preparation and immediate reentry can go very badly, even in cases where people are watching.
Can I
and
add
then,
something, Rachel?
yeah,
I'm really glad that you spoke to that, like, continuity of care planning and the barriers and limitations on like housing. It makes me think of several people that I've worked with where like specifically like the aging population. So I think that that's like a piece of this conversation where the prison system across the US has incarcerated a huge number of people with lengthy sentences. And so there are so many people that are set for no release that are going to be living the rest of their lives in prisons. And so the aging population in prison is just growing and growing, and that aging population has special needs. And so there's specific units, like in Washington, we have the SAGE unit that's kind of like a nursing care facility unit within the prison. But, you know, I've worked with people that are, you know, have spent 40 years in prison. They're in their 60s, getting out. They can't find housing that actually meets their disabilities and their needs. And then there's the layers of everything has changed in that 40 years. So also trying to learn and kind of catch up on how things work outside of the prisons. I just wanted to kind of name that unique like aging population and how this overlaps.
yeah, I appreciate it. And I think in many systems that is sort of the one of the fastest growing populations because of our sentencing laws that have just life and long sentences have expanded dramatically, and the folks that got those are now aging in the prisons with no prospect for relief. And we're just seeing prisons now build and fund more expensive units like assisted living units and stuff like that because they don't have any ability to release folks who are aging and placed in the prisons. I also wanted to put up, just because, you know, in the education context, folks here are sort of thinking through how does disability show up in educational services in particular. And I put in the chat a findings letter from the Department of Justice that I thought was really sort of excellent in going through just how hard it is for people to get accommodations in GED testing and sort of classes. It's something that we've dealt with a lot. It's sort of the very first access to education that someone might try in DOC. It's one that is more widely available because it's not as dependent on your release date as many other educational services are here in Washington. And people who need accommodations or who need extra time or who need to take the test in different formats have historically had an incredibly difficult time accessing it. And I thought this letter from the Department of Justice, I think, sort of highlights the many different ways that there can be a barrier to someone accessing educational services, and the different ways that prisons will sort of throw up barriers. So this is just one example of, I'm sure, a million different systems with a million different problems, but I was struck by sort of how similar it is to what we have seen here, and how similar it probably is to many other systems. So just specific to education.
Yeah, and then what comes up for me around specifically education is I want to say it was 2020. I'm actually going to pull. We did a report on persons with disabilities in prisons, and along with that report, there were several recommendations. Um, and one of them was related to thinking about like improving screening for learning and cognitive related disabilities or TBIs, stuff like that at reception, especially when people are not like self-identifying, or there's limited screening that's even happening for someone to be able to move forward. And in the prison system, you have to, like Rachel shared, it's super medicalized. And so if you don't have a record or an assessment or something that they can point to, um, then a lot of times those accommodations are denied. Um, and they're looking for an assessment or something to point to. And even then, the criteria is not, there's not like a clear criteria for like how they're approving or denying certain accommodations. There is like a specific committee that reviews ADA accommodations, but um, yeah, there's still issues that we see that come out of that, as far as like it's not the patient communicating what their needs are. It is another prison staff member writing something up that may or may not reflect what the person was wanting, or their reasons for needing it, or there may be missing information. I think there's been plenty of times where we've had to step in and say, I see this was reviewed and denied. Were y'all aware of this piece? And no, they weren't. And so it had to be re-reviewed and then was approved. Something, for example, like a recent person who came in to prison who has a long-term diagnosis of autism and was seeking a single cell. And there was this denial of the single cell at first, and it was based on there's not enough information. And then it was, oh, well, the records that we have are so old that they're not relevant, and not considering that the person has talked with mental health. They are showing their symptoms. They are asking for this accommodation. There's a recent need. And so having to even go through that process as someone with a disability in a prison is not clear. It's not self-moving. You have to rely on prison staff to move these things forward and hopefully communicate in your best interest what your needs are. Um, so that's coming up, and I think about, and maybe like education in my mind right now. I'm kind of thinking about not necessarily like a classroom, but I'm also thinking about like patient education, people being able to know like who are the people I need to talk to if I need an ADA accommodation. How do I know if my disability would be considered? Where do I go to find this information? If I'm denied, can I appeal? Is there anything else I can do? So I think about that stuff too, where I think there's a lot of people that don't know what their rights are, or don't know the process. And a lot of times when we're stepping in, it's connecting the right people, because it's not clear for the people who are in the prisons where to even begin.
I guess
Yeah.
oh, sorry, Rachel.
No, go for it.
Kind of on that note, I was wondering if y'all could talk about like what is the process that someone who's currently incarcerated goes through? Like when they are lacking an accommodation that they either have needed from the onset or have developed some sort of need for an accommodation, how do they like find y'all's organizations, and then what are those next steps to try and resolve that issue?
I mean, I think oftentimes it could be a couple different ways. If someone has a disability and they're looking for an accommodation, it in part depends on what the accommodation is, and sort of what route they would take, which I think is probably intentionally confusing on DOC's part. If you are looking for, because there is sort of a bright line in our prison system between medical issues and disability related issues, which is not a bright line, but is treated as a bright line within the system. So if someone is trying to access an accommodation in a program, say a job-based accommodation, so they want to be able to sit down at the job that they work in the prison, right, for 10 minutes. That would be something that they have to get approval for, either from their job supervisor, or they would have to get it like as an official, what we call here ASR, which is the sort of official approval from the prison that you can have this accommodation in your position. Sometimes it's not clear which one of those you need. Like, can you just go to your job supervisor and ask them to give you this accommodation, or should you go to the ASR process and try and get official accommodation there? Maybe you get sent to medical because it's a sort of related to a physical condition that you want to sit down. And so they say, well, I don't know, that's medical. You should go to medical and get them to give you permission. And so a lot of times where we end up coming in is when someone is stuck in this sort of doom loop of being sent to different people over and over and over, and meanwhile they don't have the accommodation. So we have for many years we ran a sort of collect call line where people could call us directly, and we would give them information and referrals and try and, like Evie said, sort of direct them to the right person in the prison where they could get the information. So and the right policy to cite to, right? So here's the ADA policy. Here's what talks about appealing a denial of an accommodation request. Encouraging people to always do all of the appeals and all of the denials and all of the grievances, because the only way that you sort of make a record of your request is in writing in the facilities. And so encouraging people never to just orally request something, really, if you can help it, because otherwise there's no record of it. So that historically is what we have been doing. When the ombuds came on board, was in place a few years ago, we have since done less of that because they are also available to do some of that work. So and so some of that we now do when we do prison monitoring. So when we go into the prisons, we have authority to walk around and just talk to folks in the prisons. And so a lot of what we do in those sort of monitoring visits is talking face to face with people about, and doing the similar sort of like technical assistance advising of like, well, have you done this? Have you tried this? Have you said it this way? Who did you talk to? Did you appeal it? Kind of troubleshooting. I don't know, Evie, if you have a different.
And I think that kind of lines up with what I was thinking. Like I've seen cases where people start at mental health and, like you said, are kind of stuck in that circle, redirected to medical. I've seen ADA accommodations start with a mental health or a medical provider and then go through a review process. One of the concerns I've been noticing lately is there's a single cell review process, but sometimes when single cells are requested as an ADA accommodation, they're still going through a general single cell review and not through an ADA specific review. And we've been able to flag some of those cases for the what's called the ASR, the Accommodation Review Committee. I think that's correct. Anyway, sorry, lots of acronyms. But yeah, like there's been cases like that they fall through the cracks because people, it's not even documented that it's an ADA request to begin with. And then as far as like contacting us for services, we have a free confidential hotline. We have people can mail us complaints, and then we also, kind of like Rachel was talking about, we do monitoring visits where we just talk to people directly. We'll go to specialized housing units and talk to folks. We recently started piloting open hours where our whole staff go into a prison and are just there in the day rooms for people to come and chat with. And we do self rents for people who are in restrictive housing. Um, and a lot of that is, yeah, similar to what Rachel is sharing of like providing technical assistance and information about what the person's options are. Um, and then in other situations where people have already tried all of the things and DOC still isn't fixing it, that's when we would open an investigation and start digging into it and try to meet with DOC to negotiate an outcome that works for the person. And I'm thinking that process is probably different from state to state. We have the care review committee and different versions of the care review committee here, and there's an ADA specific one, but that might look different in a different state.
Cool. Thank you all so much. Another thing I'm kind of wondering if y'all could speak on a little bit is, so there are certain kinds of accommodations like glasses that we may not consider like needing glasses as a disability, but obviously if you are in a position where that is being withheld, you don't have glasses, it can certainly become disabling. How is the like threshold negotiated for things like glasses or like canes where it's not this kind of black and white line of, an obvious need, but a more of a like ease of living type of need?
If I could pick one thing to immediately change, it would be this sort of concept of a very bright line between disability and medical need. They are assessing people as who are requesting things like glasses or really anything for medical necessity, right? So is it medically necessary that you get the glasses or the hearing aid or the cane or the walker or any kind of accommodation like that, that is sort of durable medical equipment type CPAP, right? That is not a reasonable, that is not a reasonable accommodation. That's not an ADA standard. That's a medical care standard, right? And so there isn't a clear line. And a lot of times someone will ask for something like a walker and say, I have to go really far. This prison is huge. I have to walk all the way across campus to get to my program. It's really painful. And I would like a walker to be able to get myself from my cell to the program room. And I can get there. It will take me longer and it will be very painful, but it would really help if I got this walker. And generally in prison, it would be denied because it's not medically necessary for you because you are technically able to get there. So that is sort of where I think a lot of times a lot of the conflict for us has been with DOC is sort of trying to get through this. Well, yeah, it's not medically necessary, but is it an accommodation that could be provided to this person so they can actually access the services that you were trying to provide to them as an accommodation? And so, and that's how you kind of get stuck in this loop between medical versus accommodations and sort of back and forth and people sending you back and forth. The other thing to think about is just a lot of prisons, Washington included, their systems have their own sort of internal guidance about when something becomes medically necessary, and it's usually way out of proportion of what you would see in the community. So, in Washington, your sort of a hearing test has to have a certain number. And if you don't get that number, you don't get hearing aids. Or maybe you get one and not two. But I don't know anyone in the community that goes in and gets their hearing tested and they're like, no, you can only have one hearing aid. That's just not what we do. Or your vision is bad, but it's not bad enough, so you don't get glasses, right? So that, I think, is another thing. Most systems will have some kind of internal guidance about what they consider to warrant medically necessary care. And oftentimes it's nowhere near what community standards are for that kind of care.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up, Rachel. Like that medical necessity is some language that I am seeing in a lot of different spaces. And I think that there's kind of this like power context to consider too around denying something as not medically necessary then becomes a clinical argument. So you have providers, doctors that are saying this is a clinical decision, this is not medically necessary. So instead of being able to have the conversation around is this a reasonable accommodation, it's then stuck to arguing a clinical decision, which as advocates, I think is probably, a sticky place to be. You can't override a clinical decision. And so I think there's like some incentives and power incentive to over medicalize this process.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to flag there are a couple of people have posted questions in the chat too. So I see one person asks, and maybe you had this question answered, but is this just for folks in Washington and referencing Massachusetts, question about someone in Massachusetts? There is a protection advocacy organization in Massachusetts. I can put the link to their website in the chat. But they are who I would reach out to if there is not an ombuds office also in Massachusetts, and I'm not familiar if there is or not. But if there isn't some kind of independent oversight entity in Massachusetts, the P&A for Massachusetts might be relevant. I think the Center for Public Representation also might do work in Massachusetts, CPR. And they've done some prison work, I believe. So they would also maybe be a referral. Someone asked what do I think the accurate number for disability in prison is? I really, very high considering the aging population, and underdiagnosis and underreporting and the stigma that can come with even identifying as having a disability. When we started doing work in the prisons, one of the first things we noticed was that when you come into receiving in prison, which is like the first place you show up, they were having people disclose their medical and mental health needs in a room full of people that they didn't know, generally wearing only underwear. And then using that as a way to sort of like say whether you need services or not, which I would suggest is not going to get you the best information from somebody or the most confidential setting. They have since built walls and changed the process, but that was for a very long time how people were being asked at intake. What kind of medical and accommodations do you need? Do you need mental health services? Are there things that we can do for you? And that was the context that was being asked in. So there, I would say it's massively undercounted, both just because there's an incentive to not count votes because then you don't have to provide accommodations, and because identifying as having a disability or a need for an accommodation can sometimes be incredibly stigmatizing. I think particularly around mental health in the prisons currently.
Yeah, I
So.
think that's a huge point of like being able to identify as having a disability is there's a risk to that in lots of different settings. And I think there's especially a risk in prisons. If people are already serving a sentence in a prison, they might not want anything in DOC's system that says anything about their mental health that may or may not be used against them. There's stuff like that, but there's also the stigma with staff, with other incarcerated people. And then I also think about people who maybe have disabilities but don't know or maybe wouldn't self-identify. I know I personally have struggled. I'm in my 30s and finally able to like recognize and admit certain disabilities. And I know there was also a time in my life where I was like, is it accurate for me to call that a disability? And so I think about a lot of people who are in the prison system that may be having that experience too, of kind of, especially in the culture of the prisons where they're defining it in this very small box of what ADA or disability looks like.
Yeah, and that's totally true.
Kind of on this note, do either of y'all have any sense on like kind of what are the demographics within the carceral spaces where there are overrepresented with people with disabilities, but like how does that break down around things like race or gender lines or kind of any of those other demographic factors?
let me see if the chart that I have. The Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Statistics, they put out something kind of recently, of sort of counting state systems and folks with disabilities. And I think they did some breakdowns that might be helpful to folks. I can find that, put it in the chat. But I mean, I would say like in Washington, at least, it seems to me, and Evie, totally say I'm wrong. I think that we have one women's prison, one that's sort of designated. And I would say it seems to me easier to access mental health services in that setting than it is in the designated men's system. I think there's a lot of reasons for that. I think, gendered assumptions of how people ask for help or need help or want help, I think go a long way in how people are being assessed as needing mental health services. I also think like just scaling services can be really different. So there, for instance, is no assisted living facility for women because there's one facility and so far fewer people. But there is one and maybe another one being developed for the men's system. So I think you do get a discrepancy in care and services between the two systems, just in a sort of gendered way. I would say, in solitary, BIPOC folks are overly represented in solitary confinement. I don't know. Part of our mental health housing is also solitary confinement, so that might skew some of the numbers in sort of what we're talking about who is in solitary. I don't know, Evie, if the Ombuds office has done more data crunching on where folks are at. Our DOC does not make that incredibly public, not surprisingly.
Yeah, I think it's making me think of a topic that we're looking into right now, and we've had a couple cases around where we're noticing that it's more likely for a white incarcerated person to be approved for residential treatment and a specialized residential treatment mental health unit than, say, a Black incarcerated person that's seeking the same services. That's something that we're kind of deep diving into just to like compare numbers and like kind of get to what's going on there. But from kind of like top view, yeah, it seems like there's some like specific barriers that folks of color are dealing with when being considered for residential treatment units versus, say, a max program or solitary confinement. And it's also this like weird bias around what is seen or described as a mental health issue versus what is seen or described as a behavioral issue. And I think that racial bias does play into that.
I have a question that was sent to me in the chat. Is the medical necessity framing aligned with the ADA, or is that a DOC interpretation / implementation?
So the medical necessity is born of Supreme Court precedent and sort of Eighth Amendment findings that it's cruel and unusual punishment is prohibited. And so what does that mean when it comes to medical care? It has to be only medically necessary care. So that's the floor of care. I think that, plays out differently in different systems or what that looks like. So the care you get in Washington's prisons might look really different. I think from another system, just because of what they're deciding is medically necessary. We have had a big push here in Washington to try to say, let's look at Medicaid. Like we've all kind of decided Medicaid is the base level care that people should get at least. And so if we're looking at standards of care, rather than just making up how bad your hearing has to be before we'll give you any kind of attention, let's look at Medicaid and see what Medicaid covers and when they cover it. And so, where that has played out is, say, people getting catheters here. For a long time, people got 2 catheters a month. we were like, what is happening? That's not, and we looked at Medicaid standard, it was like 120 a month. Like it was just like this massive disparity between what you would get in the community and what you get in prison. And so really trying to push the administrators to look at, rather than making up your own standards of care, why don't you look at what sort of general consensus is about what is being covered in the community? And the sort of access to care, gender affirming care case that we have is sort of premised on that. What is the community standard? Let's do that here. Really hoping that they continue thinking like that, because I think this medically necessary standard is really really harming people, I think, currently.
Yeah, and I don't know if there's any researchers in the room, but I think it would be really interesting to see research comparing Medicaid, Medicare, community services standards to something like a DOC health plan and what's provided. I think that's like a huge study, and it would be from state to state. But that could start looking at what's the community standard of care and what is the prison system's standard of care, and do they actually align, or are there gaps? And being able to see that from state to state, I think could be really useful.
Yeah, I think that actually just speaks to one of the questions in our Q&A about, are community standards relevant to what a person who's incarcerated is entitled to?
Yeah, they're supposed to get the same level of care that they would get in the community. And like Rachel said, I think looking at in Washington, something like Apple Care would be kind of that standard. But again, it's going to be different from state to state, because there's even differences in healthcare coverage state to state. And then I also think about, like, there's the complications, like in our state, DOC, the Department of Corrections, has authority over their health plan and health services. I recently was in New Jersey, meeting with the New Jersey ombuds over there that do similar work to our office, and they're in a completely different situation where all of their health services are contracted out through a local provider or university. And so they're not even, Department of Corrections staff or authority over that. And so that could also play a role in it, and how much ability DOC or advocates would have to address the issue when it's not even within their jurisdiction if it's contracted out.
Yeah, and we don't have private prisons here in Washington, but I suspect that some of you are in states that do. And that, the sort of who's providing medical care and what incentive you have to provide good medical care, I think is also changes even more drastically when it's a privately run prison.
Yeah, that's such a good point of, like, there's specific standards that have to be followed in a state-run facility, a public institution, versus these privately contracted facilities.
Absolutely. In the Q&A, we had a great question about if there's any type of training for DOC staff to be more sensitive to people with disabilities, like special DEI disability training for COs or other staff.
We have in the past done ADA trainings with DOC staff, either with the ADA coordinators to introduce them to the concept of what the ADA is and what the criteria are and what they should be doing, but also sometimes with a particular facility if there have been a lot of complaints about sort of officer responses to folks with mental health needs, have done sort of a training on this is what you could be considering. This is why people are talking about disability rights Washington. This is what, what you're expected to be doing. So we have done some of that training. I don't know. I mean, to me, it's more of a cultural shift than a lack of knowledge or sort of information problem. Washington has, our DOC has an ADA policy. We have ADA coordinators. Everyone gets notice of your rights under the ADA. does that mean the system works well? No. So I think it is a sort of cultural shift that is really needed, and not thinking of it as this one size fits all, everyone does the same thing, and really, like, I mean, that's a huge shift in thinking for folks, and from my perspective at least, sort of more what's needed than, like, they generally know what the ADA is. It's wanting to follow it's the problem.
Yeah, and it's making me think again about those ADA coordinator positions that are not allocated to focus on ADA. And so, yeah, there's a training requirement, but it is this small portion of that person's overall job duties. And maybe they have so much other stuff going on in their other job duties that, yeah, maybe they don't have the time or space or capacity to go beyond just the basic training to begin with. And that's also just the coordinators. It's like there are tons of staff across the facilities that work with people directly that have disabilities that maybe don't even have it, the basic trainings. And yeah, I love that perspective, Rachel, around like, I think that when we start talking about reforms and policy changes and stuff like that, um, I noticed there's this like huge focus on like training and education. And I think that, yes, training and education is important. And I think at a certain point, the system has to work no matter who's there. And that's what we're seeing.
And I think this kind of leads into the next question about this person says that they're applying to medical school and wondering what role medical professionals can play in advocating for incarcerated patients. So like that angle of it, but what is that role?
Yeah, I love that question. The first thing that comes to mind for me is around understanding, like, say you're a medical provider at a doctor's office that you're not a provider within a prison. So there's plenty of people who have off-site appointments that are working with providers in the community that may not be like a DOC doctor. And I think sometimes those providers don't feel totally clear on what information they can and can't share with the patient. And so I've seen situations where off-site medical providers, err on the side of caution. And so they just hand the packet to the guards and they send the patient off. And then they are assuming that the providers at the facility are going to relay all the information. But if you're off-site at a specialist, there's a reason you need to be hearing from the specialist. And so I would encourage people who are getting into the medical field, if you're planning to have patients that are coming from the prisons, even if you're not working as a provider in the prisons, get really clear on what authority you have in those conversations with incarcerated patients. Because I would rather people know and feel confident sharing what the patient needs to hear in those appointments than erring on the side of caution and then the patient being completely in the dark about their care, their next steps, their treatment, or having to wait weeks for a provider in DOC to pull the charts from the specialist and try to relay the findings. The patient needs to hear from the specialist what those findings are and be able to talk through what the treatment plan is. And there are still limitations where like outside providers or specialists might make a recommendation or prescribe something and it's not covered in the health plan. And so it's not going to be approved by DOC. But if you're making a recommendation for some sort of treatment or medication or something as a specialist, even if that particular thing is denied, it's setting a precedence that DOC maybe needs to find an alternative that provides the same thing that is covered in their health plan. And so getting very clear on like the orders, the follow-ups, the next steps, and I think the biggest thing is the communication with the patients. Like I have heard so often that, people get pulled out of their cell, they're transported off site, they don't even know which provider they're going to see, and then they get there and they do their testing and talk really briefly to the provider and then have to wait to hear back once they get to the prison. And I would love to see more instances where providers in the community are really educating patients and letting them know what's going on for them instead of them having to rely on DOC staff to reinterpret or relay the info. And more good providers in prisons. I mean, it is a hard system to live and work in, and I think we need good people, good providers that are willing to work in those prisons and show up for those patients. They still need medical care. I think there's a lot of people that have a stigma and an idea around incarcerated people, and so I just encourage people to get past that and try to show up and treat people as patients, because there's lots of situations where, the providers are not there for that particular type of patient, and we need people who are just as willing to show up for them.
We had one last question. On a macro level, are there any countries that have a better system in terms of disability accommodations and policies? And if so, how feasible is change in our own system?
I have not done a deep dive into other systems sort of accommodation process. Based on what I know of sort of ADA protections here and how those do or do not have similar corollaries in other countries, I would hazard a guess that sadly ours are probably ahead of the curve in comparison to some places in terms of like at least the process that we have in place. Again, that doesn't mean that the actual implementation of the process is better here, but the rules in place and the expectations, I think, are not the problem here. I mean, I think the ADA is a useful law. It is a useful beast. How it plays out in the prison context in the practical sense, I think, is actually the bigger problem, not the failure of the law itself or like needed language that needs to be better. I think, there are implementing regulations specific to the ADA that relate specifically to prisons that speak more particularly to some of the requirements that you would see in prisons. So, one of them is sort of not putting people in overly restrictive custodial settings based on a disability related need. So you can't just house someone in max custody because that's where we happen to have this particular kind of mental health service. You have to house them in appropriate custody level. So there are even implementing regulations for the ADA that are specific to prison context. So I don't think that, to me, that hasn't been the barrier. I think I can cite those just fine. But then in practicality of how that plays out in an individual prison, and jails even worse, makes that more challenging. But I don't know, Evie, if you all looked at more other systems.
No, I can't speak to kind of the international context or anything like that. Really appreciate what you're saying, Rachel, around like just the implementation and the culture. I think that's a big thing in prisons, is that I think there's this culture that is not used to oversight and is used to just being able to make the decisions and run how they want to behind closed doors. And as more and more oversight expands, there's more transparency to what's happening in these prisons, what's happening in these places. And so we can see beyond what's written in a policy to what's actually happening on the ground. The public can be more aware of that. And so, yeah, I'm just thinking about, I think for a long time, there's been this, again, safety, security kind of narrative where that can trump anything, from a prison decision standpoint. And it's it's nice to see moments where staff are seeing people as people and recognizing that something needs to happen for this individual to be able to function in this setting. They need to do something differently.
Well, I think that might be a great place for us to stop this evening. I want to thank both of y'all so much, Rachel and Evie. I really appreciated hearing about the work that y'all do in general to support people with disabilities who are currently incarcerated. But I also just really appreciated how y'all were able to dig into kind of the wide range of what disability looks like, both in general and in a carceral setting. But I think that it's sometimes hard to remember that so many of these components, like ranging from needing an assistive walking device to mental health care, to, you know, learning accommodations, that all of that is part of this umbrella. And I really loved how y'all were able to really hit at all of those kind of different levels. So to close us out, we're going to send a few things in the chat. The first thing is that I want to encourage everyone to register for our next Justice Education Series webinar. It's going to be on education and global mass incarceration. So this is going to be presented in collaboration with Incarceration Nations and the Petey Greene's Putkamer Center for Educational Justice and Equity, as well as the Global Freedom Fellows, and they'll be hosting this conversation on kind of the global landscape of education and mass incarceration. Then the next thing that I want to make sure that I shout out is that the work that we do here at the Petey Greene Program is made possible through generous donations from individuals and groups who believe in our mission to bring high quality tutoring to incarcerated learners. So we're going to send a donation link. Please consider donating to the organization, or if you aren't able, or if you don't want to donate right now, consider sharing the link on your social media accounts. This really does help signal boost the work that we're doing here together, and can be a great way, if you don't have the funds to donate yourself, to just spread the word and highlight the efforts that we have going on here at the Petey Greene Program. And then finally, you will all receive a survey to provide feedback on tonight's webinar. We really do value your input and use it to inform our programming. The way that we kind of think about what topics do we want to cover in our Justice Education Series webinars is by taking into consideration the feedback we get from volunteers. So the survey will appear in your browser when the webinar ends, and you'll also get it in a follow-up email tomorrow. So I want to thank all of y'all again for your attention and engagement tonight. Thank you for everyone who put the really amazing questions that we had in the Q&A. And then another huge thank you to our presenters, Evie and Rachel. I really appreciate y'all sharing your insights and really did enjoy tonight's talk. So thank you, everyone, and have a great evening.